The dust of the barren plains clung to Sarah's worn calico dress, a gritty shroud mirroring the desolation in her soul. For 5 years, she had endured Silas Blackwood, a man whose heart was as fallow as the field she was blamed for not making fruitful. Her crime, unspoken yet branding her daily, was the silence of her womb. In a world where a woman's worth was measured in sons, she was deemed less than nothing, a broken vessel. And now, Silas, with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly, had declared her barrenness a debt he would collect upon. Could a spirit so utterly crushed ever find a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness of such a pronouncement, a future in a world that had discarded her like chaff? "She's no good to me," Silas spat, his words striking Jedediah Thorn like a physical blow, even as the transaction was made. "But perhaps she'll do for your brat." Sarah flinched, her gaze fixed on the splintered floorboards of Miller's General Store, the shame a burning coal in her chest. She was a sack of grain, a mule, a thing to be bartered. The man before her, Jedediah Thorn, was a silhouette against the harsh morning light, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow and a weariness that seemed to seep into the very air around him. He'd said little, only nodding curtly as Silas counted the meager coins. Now, his hand, large and calloused, gestured towards the door. There were no words of comfort, no pretense of kindness, just a silent summons. She followed, her feet leaden, her heart a trapped bird fluttering wildly against her ribs. The wagon ride to his ranch was a blur of jolting discomfort and unspoken dread. The landscape was vast, unforgiving, mountains clawing at a pale sky in the distance. It was a land that swallowed small things, and Sarah felt smaller than she ever had. When they arrived, a modest cabin stood sentinel against the encroaching wilderness, smoke curling from its chimney like a fragile prayer. And then she saw them, for faces, pressed against a dusty windowpane, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Children. His children. Silas's sneering words echoed in her mind. "Perhaps she'll do for your brat." Was this her fate then? To be a drudge for another man, a caretaker for children who were not, and never could be, her own. Jedediah spoke for the first time since the store, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. "This is Sarah. She'll be staying with us." He didn't say a helping, he didn't say a working, just staying. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 12 with Jedediah's serious eyes, scowled. A girl, a little younger, hid behind him, her gaze darting. Another boy, smaller still, simply stared, while the littlest one, a girl with tangled blonde hair, clutched a faceless rag doll. Sarah's breath hitched. They were a portrait of loss, motherless, their faces etched with a premature gravity. Jedediah led her into the cabin. It was clean but stark, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, old grief, and the faint, sweet smell of baking, a ghost of domesticity. He gestured to a small cot in the corner, separated from the main room by a thin, patched curtain. "This will be yours." Sarah could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The silence of the room was broken only by the crackling fire and the children's hushed whispers from outside. She sank onto the cot, the rough blanket a small comfort. She was no longer Silas's property, but what was she now? A purchased woman in a lonely man's cabin, surrounded by his wary children, her future as barren and uncertain as the land outside. Could a heart, so profoundly broken, ever learn to trust again, to hope again, in a place that felt like the very edge of the world? The first days at the Thorn Ranch bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of chores performed in a haze of apprehension. Sarah moved like a ghost through the small cabin, her voice a forgotten thing, her spirit bruised and tender. Jedediah was a man of few words, his presence a constant, silent weight. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, his movements economical, his face a mask of stoic endurance. He expected nothing from her, it seemed, beyond her mere presence, yet the unspoken question of her purpose hung heavy in the air. The children were like wild, cautious creatures. Matthew, the eldest, watched her with an unnerving intensity, his gaze often accusatory, as if she were an intruder who had trespassed upon their carefully guarded sorrow. Rebecca, quiet and observant, would flit away if Sarah's eyes met hers for too long. Daniel, the younger boy, was a whirlwind of restless energy, mostly ignoring her existence. Only Lily, the youngest, with her wide, cornflower blue eyes and the ever-present rag doll, showed any flicker of unguarded curiosity. Sometimes, Sarah would feel Lily's gaze on her as she kneaded dough or mended worn trousers, a silent, questioning look that pricked at the layers of her numbness. Sarah's hands, once soft, quickly became chapped and raw from the lye soap, the unfamiliar labor of the ranch. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes in a near-frozen creek, helped with the meager garden, her body aching with a fatigue that was almost a comfort, for it dulled the sharper pains of her heart. She remembered Silas's mother, a woman whose rare kindness had been a balm in her early, terrified years of marriage. The old woman had taught her to make soap, to preserve what little they had, to find solace in the rhythm of work. A small, tarnished thimble, a relic from those days, was Sarah's only possession, kept hidden in the folds of her dress. It was a symbol of a life before, a tiny anchor to a self she barely recognized. One afternoon, as a chill wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, Sarah found Lily huddled by the hearth, tears silently tracing paths down her dusty cheeks. Her rag doll lay beside her, its crudely stitched arm nearly torn off. Without a word, Sarah sat beside the child. Lily flinched, then looked up, her lower lip trembling. Sarah gently picked up the doll. "She's hurt," Lily whispered, her voice small and fragile. Sarah's heart ached. She knew what it was to be broken, discarded. From the tiny pocket of her apron, she retrieved her thimble and a needle and thread she'd salvaged. Slowly, carefully, her fingers, clumsy from disuse in such delicate work, began to mend the doll's arm. Lily watched, mesmerized, her tears forgotten. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, but in that small circle of flickering light, a fragile connection was being stitched together. When she was done, she handed the doll back to Lily. The child clutched it tightly, then, to Sarah's astonishment, leaned her small head against Sarah's arm for a fleeting moment before scrambling away. Jedediah, entering silently, had witnessed the exchange from the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a softening in his gaze, a flicker of something other than weariness. He said nothing, merely nodded and turned to stir the stew simmering over the fire. That night, as Sarah lay on her cot, the silence of the cabin felt different, less oppressive. A tiny seed of warmth, fragile and tentative, had taken root in the frozen earth of her heart. But the vastness of the plains outside, the judgment she knew awaited in the distant settlement, the raw grief that still clung to this family, these were shadows that loomed large. Could such a small, tender shoot of hope possibly survive in such harsh and unforgiving soil? The seasons on the prairie turned with a relentless, unyielding rhythm, each bringing its own trials and small, hard-won victories. Sarah found a quiet purpose in the endless cycle of work, her hands growing capable, her spirit slowly unfurling like a plant starved of light. She learned the language of the land, the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, the subtle shift in the quality of light that heralded a coming storm, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. She learned, too, the language of the Thorn children. Matthew's gruffness, she discovered, was a shield for a boy forced to grow up too soon, his heart fiercely protective of his younger siblings. Rebecca's shyness hid a keen intellect and a surprising wit, which would occasionally sparkle in a shared glance or a softly spoken observation. Daniel, once he realized Sarah wasn't a threat but a steady, quiet presence, began to include her in his imagined adventures, regaling her with tales of fighting off bears and outlaws in the nearby woods. And Lily, sweet Lily, became her shadow, her small hand often finding its way into Sarah's as they walked to the creek or gathered eggs. The mended rag doll, now named Hope by Lily, was a constant companion. Jedediah remained a man of few words, but his silence was no longer a source of unease for Sarah. It became a shared space, comfortable and unburdened by the need for pretense. She saw the way his eyes followed the children, a deep, abiding love etched in every line of his weathered face. She saw the strain of his solitary efforts to keep his family afloat, the quiet grief that still shadowed him. He, in turn, began to see Sarah not as the battered woman Silas had discarded, but as a gentle strength, a quiet competence that brought a semblance of order and warmth to their fractured home. He noticed the way the children gravitated towards her, the subtle easing of tension in the cabin since her arrival. One evening, a fever took hold of young Daniel. He tossed and turned, his skin burning, his small whimpers tearing at Sarah's heart. Jedediah was frantic, his usual stoicism crumbling. He'd lost his wife to a fever, and the fear was a raw, palpable thing in the small cabin. Sarah, drawing on a deep well of forgotten knowledge passed down by her own grandmother, took charge. She bathed Daniel's forehead with cool cloths, coaxed sips of willow bark tea between his parched lips, and sat with him through the long, dark hours, her presence a calm anchor in their storm of anxiety. Jedediah watched her, his initial fear slowly giving way to a grudging admiration, then something warmer. He saw not a barren woman, but a nurturing spirit, a fierce tenderness that mirrored the love he felt for his own. By morning, Daniel's fever had broken. He lay sleeping peacefully, his small hand clutching Sarah's. Jedediah looked at Sarah, his eyes conveying more than words ever could. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. You saved him." The words, simple and heartfelt, were a balm to Sarah's soul. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged her worth in years. But their fragile peace was not to last. Word of the new woman at the Thorn Ranch had reached the small settlement of Redemption, a town whose name belied the often judgmental nature of its inhabitants. Whispers followed Sarah like flies whenever she accompanied Jedediah to Miller's for supplies. "That Thorn fella, taking in another man's leavings barren," they say. "What good is she to him and those poor children?" The self-righteous pronouncements of Mrs. Abigail Henderson, the preacher's wife and the town's self-appointed moral guardian, were the loudest. She looked at Sarah with undisguised disdain, her gaze sweeping over Sarah's mended dress and worn hands. "A woman's place is defined by her piety and her fruitfulness, Mr. Thorn," she declared loudly one day in the store, for all to hear. One wonders what example this arrangement sets for your impressionable children. Jedediah had stood firm, his hand protectively on Sarah's arm. "Mrs. Henderson," he'd said, his voice dangerously quiet, "Sarah is a good woman, and a blessing to my family. Her worth is not for you to measure, but the seeds of doubt and shame, so deeply ingrained in Sarah, were easily reawakened by the community's scorn. Could she ever truly belong here, or would she always be an outsider, her past a stain that could never be washed away? Would the tentative bond she had forged with Jedediah and his children be strong enough to withstand the coming storm of societal judgment, or worse, the possible resurgence of the man who had once owned her? The biting winds of late autumn swept across the plains, carrying with them the scent of snow and an undercurrent of foreboding. The whispers from Redemption had not ceased. If anything, they grew more insidious, fanned by Mrs. Henderson's fervent pronouncements from the pulpit and the general store. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment keenly, a constant ache that even the growing warmth within the Thorn cabin couldn't fully dispel. She saw the way Jedediah's jaw tightened when they faced the averted gazes and hushed condemnations in town, the protective glint in his eyes as he shielded her from the worst of it. His quiet solidarity was a shield, but the arrows of scorn still found their mark on her already wounded spirit. Then, one cold, grey afternoon, as Jedediah was out mending fences on the far pasture, a lone rider approached the cabin. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat, a cold dread gripping her. The man was Silas Blackwood. He dismounted with a swagger, his eyes, like chips of ice, raking over the cabin, then settling on Sarah with a possessive, contemptuous sneer. Well, he drawled, his voice the same gravelly rasp that had haunted her nightmares. "Look what we have here. Playing house, are we, Sarah?" Lily, who had been playing near the porch, ran to Sarah, her small face pale with fear. Sarah pulled the child behind her, her body a trembling shield. "What do you want, Silas?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, yet threaded with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. "Want?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I've come for what's mine. Seems Thorn here got a bargain. Maybe I didn't charge enough for damaged goods." His gaze lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Or maybe," he continued, his eyes narrowing, "you ain't so barren after all. Maybe you just needed a different plow for your field." The crude insinuation struck her harder than a physical blow. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Sarah, momentarily eclipsing her fear. Before she could speak, Matthew burst from the cabin, a stout piece of firewood clutched in his hand, his young face a mask of fury. "Leave her alone," he yelled, planting himself between Sarah and Silas. "She's not yours anymore." Silas merely chuckled. "Brave little pup, ain't he? Thorn teach you that?" Just then, the sound of hoofbeats announced Jedediah's return. He took in the scene at a glance: Silas's leering presence, Sarah's terrified defiance, Matthew's brave stance, Lily clinging to Sarah's skirt. His face, usually so controlled, darkened like a thunderhead. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, dangerous. "Blackwood," Jedediah's voice was low, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. "You're not welcome here." "Get off my land," Silas straightened, a sneer playing on his lips. "Your land? Last I checked, Thorn, the woman was mine." "A man has a right to his property." "Sarah is not property," Jedediah stated, his voice resonating with a conviction that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "She is a valued member of this family. She is home." The word, spoken with such quiet certainty by this steadfast man, settled in Sarah's heart like a warm stone. Silas scoffed. "Family? With a barren woman? You're a fool, Thorn. I'll give you back what you paid, and a little extra for your trouble. She's coming with me." He took a step towards Sarah. Jedediah moved instantly, placing himself squarely in Silas's path. The two men stood inches apart, a silent, volatile standoff. "She's not going anywhere," Jedediah said, his eyes like flint. "If you try to take her, you'll have to go through me." The air crackled with tension. Sarah watched, her breath held, her fear warring with a fierce, protective love for this man and these children who had become her world. For a terrifying moment, she thought Silas would resort to violence. His hand twitched towards the hunting knife at his belt. But then, he seemed to deflate slightly, perhaps recognizing the unyielding resolve in Jedediah's stance, or perhaps simply realizing the fight wasn't worth the effort for something he truly considered worthless. "You'll regret this, Thorn," Silas hissed, his eyes burning with malice. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." "She's cursed." He spat on the ground, then mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and bitter resentment in his wake. The silence he left behind was profound, broken only by Lily's soft sniffles. Sarah sagged against the cabin wall, her legs weak with relief. Jedediah turned to her, his expression softening. He gently took her arm. "Are you all right, Sarah?" She could only nod, tears welling in her eyes, tears not of fear this time, but of an overwhelming gratitude and a dawning realization of her own strength, a strength reflected and affirmed by the man who stood before her. The confrontation had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of her doubt. But as the immediate danger passed, a new anxiety arose. Silas's parting words, "She'll bring you nothing but trouble," echoed ominously. Would his malice find other avenues? And what of the community? Would this open defiance further ostracize them, or could it, perhaps, begin to shift the tide of their judgment? The prairie winter was closing in, promising isolation and hardship. Would their newly forged family unit be strong enough to weather not only the elements, but also the lingering shadows of Sarah's past and the animosity of a scornful world? The encounter with Silas Blackwood, though terrifying, acted as a strange catalyst. It had stripped away pretenses and laid bare the fierce, protective core of their unconventional family. Jedediah's unwavering defense of Sarah, his public declaration of her value, resonated far beyond the confines of their ranch. News of the confrontation traveled quickly to Redemption, carried on the winds of gossip, but this time, the narrative began to shift. Some still sided with Mrs. Henderson's rigid morality, but others, particularly those who had known hardship themselves, saw a different story, a tale of courage, of a good man protecting a vulnerable woman, of a family standing united against cruelty. The children, too, had been transformed by the event. Matthew, having stood up to Silas, carried himself with a new maturity, his protective instincts towards Sarah now openly displayed. Rebecca, often so reserved, sought Sarah out more frequently for quiet conversations, sharing her thoughts and dreams. Daniel chattered incessantly about Pa sending that bad man packing, his admiration for his father and Sarah evident. And Lily, her small hand almost permanently residing in Sarah's, seemed to blossom under the secure warmth of her affection. The harsh prairie winter descended, blanketing the land in a thick shroud of snow, isolating them further. But within the small cabin, a warmth grew that had little to do with the crackling fire in the hearth. It was the warmth of shared purpose, of unspoken understanding, of love taking root in the most unexpected of places. Sarah, no longer feeling like an outsider, threw herself into creating a true home. She mended clothes with a newfound cheerfulness, her thimble a familiar comfort on her finger. She cooked hearty meals that filled the cabin with savory aromas, coaxing smiles from even the stoic Jedediah. She told the children stories by the firelight, her voice, once hesitant, now filled with a gentle confidence. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them indoors, Lily brought Sarah a small, clumsily carved wooden bird. "For you," she whispered, her eyes shining. "Because you help us fly." As Sarah's heart swelled. She looked at Jedediah, who was watching them with a tender expression that made her breath catch. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Jedediah sat beside Sarah by the dying embers of the fire. The silence between them was no longer just comfortable, it was charged with unspoken emotions. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough, "what you've done for my children, for me. I don't have the words. You gave me a home, Jedediah," she replied softly, her gaze meeting his. "You showed me I wasn't worthless." He reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers. "You were never worthless, Sarah." It was Silas who was blind. His thumb traced the lines on her hand, sending a shiver through her. "This place, it was just a house before you came. You've made it a home. You've brought light back into our lives." His eyes, usually so guarded, were open and vulnerable, reflecting the firelight and something deeper, something that mirrored the burgeoning emotion in her own heart. "The children, they love you, Sarah." As their mother, the word hung in the air, potent and transformative. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "And I love them, Jedediah. More than I ever thought possible." He drew a little closer, his gaze searching hers. "And what of me, Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Could you find it in your heart to care for a plain, quiet man like me?" Sarah's answer was not in words, but in the slow, shy smile that spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her from within. She leaned into him, her head finding a natural resting place on his strong shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The storm outside raged on, but within the small cabin, a profound peace settled. The final test, however, came with the spring thaw. A fire, sparked by lightning in the dry timberline above their valley, began to spread rapidly, driven by strong winds, threatening the scattered homesteads, including their own. Panic gripped the small community. Men rushed to fight the blaze, but it was a losing battle. As the flames drew dangerously close to the Thorn ranch, smoke choking the air, Jedediah was torn. He needed to help fight the main fire line threatening the entire valley, but he couldn't leave his family unprotected. It was Sarah who made the decision. "Go, Jedediah," she urged, her face smudged with soot but her eyes clear and determined. "Help the others. Matthew and I, we can protect the cabin. We know what to do." He hesitated, his heart warring with his duty. But seeing the quiet strength in her face, the resolute set of Matthew's jaw beside her, he knew she was right. He kissed her then, a desperate, grateful kiss in the smoky haze, a promise of return. "Be safe," he whispered, before riding off to join the line of men. For hours, Sarah and Matthew, with Rebecca and Daniel helping to haul water and wet down sacks, fought the encroaching flames. They dug fire breaks, beat back embers with wet blankets, their faces grim, their bodies aching, but their spirits unbroken. Sarah, her dress singed, her hair wild, moved with a focused energy, her fear transmuted into fierce determination. She was no longer the broken woman sold for her barrenness, she was a protector, a matriarch defending her home, her family. When Jedediah finally returned, exhausted but triumphant, as the rains came and the main fire was contained, he found his cabin standing, an oasis in a blackened landscape, thanks to Sarah's unwavering courage. The community, witnessing her bravery and the family's resilience, saw her not as an outcast, but as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson herself, her home saved by the collective effort, offered Sarah a respectful nod, a silent admission of her misjudgment. That evening, as the sun set, painting the smoke-tinged sky in hues of orange and purple, Jedediah stood with Sarah on the porch, overlooking their saved land. The children were inside, their happy chatter a balm to their weary souls. He took her hand, his gaze filled with an immeasurable love and respect. "Silas called you cursed, Sarah," he said softly. "He was wrong. You are the greatest blessing this family has ever known." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, plain gold band, his late wife's wedding ring. He'd kept it tucked away, a symbol of a past he thought he'd never move beyond. "It's not much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But if you'll have it, if you'll have me, I reckon we could make it official. Make this family whole." In the eyes of God and man, tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded, unable to speak. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. She was no longer Sarah the barren, Sarah the outcast. She was Sarah Thorn, wife, mother, a woman who had found her worth not in her ability to bear children, but in the boundless capacity of her heart to love and be loved. The lonely rancher and his 4 children had not just given her shelter, they had given her a family, a purpose, and a love truer than any she had ever dared to dream. And in healing them, she, too, had finally been made whole. The future stretched before them, uncertain as the prairie seasons, but they would face it together, their love a beacon against any darkness.